Hello and welcome to a class about cinnamon rolls. My name is Sam and I'm a chef here at Basics Market. During this class, if you're joining us live, you're welcome to ask questions or make comments, and I will be relayed whatever you'd like to say will be relayed to me. You have a little thing you can click on your Zoom meeting deal there on your screen. And then also you're welcome to email us with more questions anytime, and we'll get back to you as soon as we can and as best we can. So let's get into this. With the cinnamon rolls that we're making this evening, we're able to utilize some of our products that we make ourselves, and that are made for us by chickens and cows, I guess. But we have our Gwendolyn's eggs we're going to be using, and we're going to be using the Lulabelle's butter and milk. And you can see I have a lovely poster here of the milk, which does come in these glass bottles as well as cardboard cartons. And so I'm going to go ahead and just go through the recipe here. Let's first begin by proofing the yeast, because I want to get that going. So I have some of that Lulabelle's whole milk here, and this is half a cup of milk. And I simply heated this up in a saucepan to 100 degrees. I used the thermometer, so usually it'll come up pretty quickly. And then I just let it cool back down to 100 degrees or a little less. You kind of, just like when you're using water to make bread and you're adding yeast, the general rule of thumb is that when the liquid is sort of your body temperature, if you dip your finger into it, or feel under the faucet if you're using water, if it's equal to your body temperature, that's where you want it. Now, this recipe uses both active dry yeast and baking powder as leaveners. So leaveners are what makes the dough puff and get fluffy for us. So you don't want to have your liquid, and in this case the milk, you don't want it too hot or it will kill the yeast. So active dry yeast is a pretty neat thing. It's a bunch of little yeast critters, and they're all dried, and when you hydrate them, they come back to life and they start breathing, and they create carbon dioxide, which creates a lot of little bubbles, and then that's what makes our dough rise. This technology of a yeast like this, the active dry yeast, is a relatively new invention. Before this, yeast was just caught in the air, and sourdough is still a form of yeast where we see that it's just captured and then fed. And so yeast likes to eat sugar. So there's sugar in milk, and there's sugar in flour, and there's sugar, of course, in sugar. So I'm adding a teaspoon of sugar to the milk and yeast, and we're going to let this proof. Now, proofing is simply that you're just proving that the yeast is active. And this is most important if you have some yeast that's a little dated, it's been hanging around a bit, and you really want to make sure that it's active. Otherwise, the proofing section does help to really dissolve the yeast, and that just helps it thoroughly mix into your dough. Is it entirely necessary, this step of proofing? No. If you have a good yeast, which you're really confident about, it's new and fresh and all that, you can kind of skip this step. Your dough may take a little longer to rise. This does kind of kick things into gear. So that's something to keep in mind. But also along those lines, when you have a longer rising dough, it develops more flavor. So that's not necessarily a bad thing. One thing I've been enjoying lately is making sourdough cinnamon rolls, which turn out really well. But it's like a 2 or 3 day rise, and one of my kids is gluten intolerant, so she can eat regular flour if it's had a really long rise, and especially sourdough based stuff. And if it's had at least a 12-hour rise, all that gluten that upsets her tummy gets eaten up by the yeast. So that's kind of cool, and by the sourdough. So um, what I was saying about that active dry yeast, though, there in the olden times, right, there was this yeast was harvested off of brewers. So there'd be like a beer making a brewery, and then there'd be a bakery next to it, and the bakers would go and they'd get the skimming of the yeast off of the top and make the daily bread that way. And eventually, it was Fleshman who figured out a way to just make the yeast itself, skim it, dry it, and then have it readily available. And it really revolutionized baking, and that suddenly, we have big commercial bakeries and stuff like that. So it's pretty neat. This way, I just used like 1 packet of yeast, which is like 2¼ teaspoons of yeast. But 2 teaspoons is good. If you have a little less yeast, that's fine, because it grows, it multiplies, and that extra 1/4 teaspoon isn't going to hurt anything. All right, so what we're doing here is we're just kind of waiting for some bubbles to form. And meanwhile, let's go ahead and get our dry ingredients together. So I'm going to put 3 cups of flour, and this is just all-purpose flour. I like this Bob's Red Mill stuff, is a good local product here in the Portland area. And with flour, one thing you always want to do is with flour or with baking in general and all these dry ingredients, you always want to measure and level. So you want a level measurement. With cooking, and when I'm just cooking a dish which isn't baking, I am a little more free with my measurements and just kind of improvising. With baking, I really like to, I do actually follow the formula, follow the recipe, and exact measurements are pretty important to get the same results every time. And so leveling, and I'm just using the side of the bag here and my hand to level, but if you wanted to get really technical, you could use use the back of a knife, or here's a spatula, is a pretty good deal. All right, so that's our 3 cups of flour. And then I have the salt here, and I believe it's 1½ teaspoons of salt. And also we're going to put in the 1½ teaspoons of baking powder, which is our other leavening or thing that's going to help the dough rise. So it's kind of neat because we're going to get some good fluffy cinnamon rolls here by doing these 2 methods of the rise. So you can see how the yeast is coming up there, and we're getting some bubbles. So that's what we're looking for. And this will continue to get frothy and bubble up. I won't have us hang out for 10 minutes to watch that happen. And I trust it will, because this is some brand new yeast. Now, yeast stores really well in the refrigerator, and in the freezer it will store indefinitely. In the refrigerator, you have a year or so with yeast, so it's really stable. The active dry yeast, though, is sensitive to heat, as I mentioned before, so you want to keep it cool and you want to keep it dry. Okay, so what we're going to use to, I just whisked all that together to get it nice and evenly distributed. and we're going to make our dough. Um, and so this dough will rise, and it's going to rise um, until doubled in bulk. And that's usually a couple hours. And it does depend on the heat. And so in the summertime, and if your ambient temperature is warmer, it will rise a little faster. And if you want to slow the rise, you can refrigerate this dough. So what I like to do when I'm making cinnamon rolls is I like to make them the night, I make the dough the night ahead, or the afternoon, I should say, ahead, and let it rise. And then I roll it out, which we're going to do, and fill it, cut them, put them in my pan, and then and then I go ahead and cover them and put them in the refrigerator overnight. And then I get up really early, and here's the yogurt, and here's an egg. And so I'm going to go ahead and pop this egg into the yogurt. Get up early, pull them out, let them come to room temperature, and puff up a little bit to 25% more rise. And then when I get up and make my coffee and stuff, get the oven going and just pop them in the oven. And then you can have cinnamon rolls nice and fresh in the morning. And so that's a good way to do it. And that sort of slowing down the rising process is a neat way to go. And that you can actually, you could make this dough a day ahead, and maybe just, you might have to punch it down a couple times as it rises. All right, so I put my yeast and milk mixture, and then here's the yogurt, one Gwendolyn's egg, and 3/4 cup of low-fat yogurt is what I'm using here. And so I mix the you can mix that all in at one time, the milk, yeast, yogurt, and egg mixtures can go in there simultaneously. Now, a little bit of water I have noticed with this recipe. It usually takes just a little bit of water, like maybe a tablespoon, to get it hydrated. And so that's you just want it to come together into a shaggy dough. It's going to be a little bit sticky, and you can see just that little bit of, that's probably a little less than a tablespoon of water, just brings it together. Now, if it feels overhydrated to you, you can add a little flour, and that's fine. And it's just, you just wanted to find that balance to get a good sticky dough. I think we have a question.
Someone was asking if the yogurt was at room temperature.
The yogurt was it was at room temperature, but that's that's probably a good idea. Like usually with this kind of thing, it is good to have your ingredients at room temperature. So yeah, it was, but if it wasn't, it wouldn't hurt anything either.
We have one more.
Yes.
Can you use Greek plain yogurt instead of just plain yogurt?
Yes, yeah, any sort of yogurt will work here. And then, so you might end up looking at, that's just what you've got in your refrigerator. I'm sure would be, the first thing I would look at. But then if you're like someone who's watching, calories, things like that, you might tend towards a non-fat yogurt, which would work great. Any sort of yogurt you got, and then that is the interesting point about this dough in particular. This recipe is we're using yogurt, and traditionally in a cinnamon roll, you'd be using use butter, or even what's it called, vegetable shortening, or lard, or something like that. So this is already a little bit lighter, and it does make for a really nice light sort of cinnamon roll. Okay, so I've turned that sort of sticky, shaggy dough out, and we're just going to knead it a little bit. Yes, another question.
Will you explain what shaggy dough is?
Oh yeah. So shaggy dough. Let's just have a look at it. I mean, better to see than for me to talk about it, right? It's just kind of so you can see it's a little bit sticky. It's sticking to my hands a tad. It doesn't have it's not super cohesive. Um, so it's still like has a little bit of separateness, and it has the shag there is just how it sort of breaks apart like that. And what we're going to do is bring it together with kneading. So a shaggy dough, we're looking at, it has a pretty good moisture content to start. And that's what's going to give us a nice tender cinnamon roll. So I'm going to knead this for a couple minutes, just 3 minutes or so. This doesn't need, or need to be kneaded a whole lot. We're not wanting to develop a ton of gluten here, which is what happens when you're kneading the dough, like for bread or something. You might knead it longer and get those nice long protein strands going for the chew. We don't necessarily want a real chewy cinnamon roll, right? So with kneading, I really enjoy kneading. I've had a great day today because this is my third batch of cinnamon roll dough for this class because we have different stages. And I find it very therapeutic to knead, and I like to do it daily if I can. And so my method is I just use my palm and I kind of push in, and then I give it a spin, quarter turn, and I'll use my palm again, and this is how I'll knead bread, pizza dough, and cinnamon rolls. And you just want to add a little flour as you go, just enough so that your dough doesn't stick to the surface you're kneading on, and just keep on going, and you'll find that soon it's going to start to come together. It will become smoothed out a tad, and then you're getting really close. And you just want it to sort of have that bounce, a little bit of elasticity, and you want to be able to spank it, and when it makes that good spanking sound, then you're there, and that is the knead. All right, so this dough is ready to go into a bowl, and I have a bowl ready here. And so this is you want to give it some room to grow. This is a lightly oiled mixing bowl. Yes, another question.
If you wanted to make this recipe gluten-free, could you? We have somebody who likes using the better batter flour for baking.
Okay, I have not used that one. I've used Bob's 1-to-1 a lot, and I think you could definitely do this with the gluten-free. As I mentioned, I have not done this yet with gluten-free flour because I'm able to get away with the sourdough style for my daughter who's gluten intolerant. But I was doing a lot of baking before I discovered that she could eat like sourdough, and then as soon as I found that out, I was like, oh man, I can go back to using sourdough because I really enjoy that. But you can use, I'd experiment with your gluten-free flour. Sometimes you need to adjust, I noticed, with the gluten-free, either less or more flour, depending on the recipe. But when, you get it to this sort of consistency, and with the gluten-free flour, you probably wouldn't need it so much, but maybe a bit. I noticed with the gluten-free flour, you don't really get the bounce with the knead, but I think it would definitely you'd get a good cinnamon roll. Worth a go. All right. So we have our dough ball, and I'm just going to place it in that lightly oiled bowl. Okay, and then we're going to cover it. Now, you can cover this just with a plate. That's what I do a lot, is I'll just put a plate that fits over my bread bowl, my dough ball bowl. And that way I'm not using plastic wrap or messy. Sometimes towel, lightly, like a damp towel is a tea towel is another way to go. And but with this recipe, there is the recommendation about a way to keep an eye on the rise, and it's kind of a cool trick. So I am going to demonstrate that, and plastic wrap does work really well for letting your dough rise effectively without getting air in there. And the reason you want to cover your dough is the air will dry it out. And so this just creates a nice environment for that dough to grow, and all those yeasts to breathe and fluff up your dough. So the trick here is you draw a circle, and you just draw the circle right around the size of the dough ball. And then this way you can come and look at it, and I just look directly down. And then as soon as it's doubled, you're ready to go. And that's kind of a fun way to keep an eye on it and really see how much it's growing. And then another great way to check your dough is just to give it a little poke. And as soon as you can go in pretty far and it puffs back up, it's good to go. But again, you're looking at probably 2 hours with this in an ambient, regular household temperature, kitchen temperature. Okay, so we're going to set this guy aside and swap it out with a dough that I did make several hours ago, and this one I actually made earlier today, and then I had it in the refrigerator for a while. I punched it down a couple times. I drove it around in the boot of my car at an 80-degree temperature, so it's great. It's a really good dough. It's probably going to have excellent flavor, nicely developed. So we'll pretend that our dough has risen, right? It's been a couple hours, and one kind of special tool that you don't get to use a lot in the kitchen is measuring tape, and we're going to use this to measure out our rectangle and get it just right. So we're going to go ahead and roll out the dough, and actually before we get into that, let's talk about the filling a little bit. So with the filling, we are going to be using some of the Lulabelle's butter. Now, you can use salted or unsalted butter here. It's up to you. The salted butter is very tasty, and I do either one. Again, it's sort of what you've got on hand, or if you're watching your sodium intake, you might want to go unsalted. Yes.
One more question about the dough. Do you need to punch it down, or can you just leave it to rise on its own? Is there a purpose to punching it down?
The purpose to punching it down is just once it rises to a certain point, it can kind of rise, and then deflate. So you want to catch it before it gets to that point, and that's the punch down just buys you some more time. Now, so that punching down would just be if you're going for that longer rise, and say you made it in the morning, and then you got into some other things and you weren't able to get to it when you thought, you can punch it down several times and just come back to it and kind of keep it within that range of doubling. And so once it gets to double, you punch it down and let it double again. And that's the only purpose. But yeah, you can use it right as soon as it's doubled. It's ready. Okay, so before we roll out the dough, we want to look at our filling a little bit. So what I did with the filling has half a cup of melted butter. So this is butter I just melted in a pot, the saucepan. And that's one stick of the Lulabelle's butter. And then I have brown sugar and cinnamon. So the main thing I wanted to point out is I just have that butter already melted and semi-cool, ready to go. Yes, another question.
A follow-up to the dough question. Will
Yeah.
that not kill the yeast?
Oh, no, the yeast, yeast is very durable and it enjoys it enjoys the abuse. It won't mind at all. And yeast just keeps growing and growing, you know, and that's sort of the neat thing about yeast. And you know, when you're looking at like sourdoughs and natural yeast that you're catching from the air, it's pretty fascinating how there's so many strains and different yeasts get along and grow together and stuff like that. Another question.
Could these be assembled tonight and baked in the morning? Would that be enough time?
Oh yeah, that would be great. Like if you make your dough now and say maybe, I mean, maybe you're working, some of you might be working along with me here. So you have your dough is already rising. Yeah, so once your dough is doubled and then you can get to this point that I'm doing here and just go all the way through to putting the rolls together and then cover them and put them in the refrigerator and they'll be ready to bake in the morning. And like I mentioned, that is my favorite way to do cinnamon rolls. You know, to have them ready to be able to eat them in the morning like that, and it works great. So what I'm going to do first is just sort of pat the dough out into a rectangle-like shape, and then I'm going to use a rolling pin to get it a little more even. And we'll use our, you can see there's all these great bubbles forming and stuff from the yeast doing its job. So here we go, we can start to measure. So we're looking for a 12 by 10. So I'm like 8 by 11 right now. And it's going to end up at about a 1/4 inch thickness. And you know, I like to get a pretty even rectangle, but it is after all dough and it will be, it's not going to be a perfect rectangle. And I understand that. One thing I noticed as well is as you roll it, it tends to grow a little bit. So there's that to keep in mind. So it's at a perfect 12 there and about an 8 wide. So we'll go a little bit wider and let's see what we've got. And so it always wants to sort of bounce back, pull back. And then the tricky thing, if you are going for that rectangular shape, is just to the corners, and it helps just to kind of pull them out a little bit because they want to shrink back. Okay, so there's a 10 and 12. So that's what that looks like, and that's a 10 to 12. And then what you can do is sort of shore it up with your rolling pin, and this makes it kind of, for a minute, look really neat and tidy. And then we're going to go ahead and get into our filling. Right? So there's our lovely rectangle. Um, the filling, so you'll need a bowl for this, and a whisk is a good tool. Spatula for spreading. And then here's our melted butter, and I'm going to go ahead and put that melted butter right in the bowl. And the butter doesn't have to be cool. It can still be warm. The trick here, the reason I like to have it just slightly cool is that it kind of helps with the consistency of this filling from being too runny. It's a good consistency to spread, and that's what you want. But if like the butter is super hot, it tends to melt the sugar a lot right off the bat, and then you get it's just harder to keep that filling in your dough. And then this is 2.5 tablespoons of cinnamon. Excuse me, cinnamon. Now I'm using this Vietnamese cinnamon, and that's just what I had in the kitchen here. There's like four major groups of cinnamon. Cinnamon comes from a tree. It's the inner lining of the bark of a tree. Now, the Ceylon cinnamon is considered the true cinnamon from the cinnamon tree, and then other species, offshoots, cousins of the cinnamon, are the cassia variety, which is like a Chinese cinnamon. And then we also have Vietnamese or Saigon cinnamon. And so the Vietnamese and the Chinese cinnamon are stronger flavors, and that's what I prefer for the cinnamon rolls. I made a batch of cinnamon rolls a couple batches ago, and I used Ceylon cinnamon, and my family was like, I can't taste any cinnamon in here, because the Ceylon cinnamon has a more mild and sweet flavor, and so it's good for certain applications, but a lot of people find that it's kind of mild in a cinnamon roll, and you might want something with a little more punch, so you might look for Chinese or Vietnamese or Saigon cinnamon for your cinnamon rolls. Now, in ancient Egypt, they used cinnamon to embalm mummies, and so if you want to embalm something, you're halfway there. So anyway, so this is a good dose of cinnamon and brown sugar and all this jive, and this is a great method where you're adding the cinnamon and brown sugar to the butter and getting it all mixed together. In in the past, I have made cinnamon rolls where I just spread the stuff out individually, and I tend to under underdo it on the sugar and cinnamon. So this makes sure this is a good formula to really get you enough good filling in there. Okay, so let me use that spatula. That's odd. Well, I'll use this one. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and just spread this stuff out with a spatula. Oh, there's my red one. And so you can see that this is really nice, just kind of holding together so that we can get a good even spread. And that's really what you're looking for here. Boy, this dough is rising in front of our eyes. It's already really puffy. Yeah, and that butter, maybe I let it cool down too much. Like it's sort of just finding that spot where it will spread nicely, but maybe isn't going to bunch up like this. But this is still spreading pretty good. It's just a little bit of work. So what I'm doing is I'm going right to the edges. Um, and you want to leave just a little blank area on your cinnamon roll canvas here, around the edges. And especially these long edges, because we're going to leave a little bit to pinch at the end. Just, I like to secure them a bit. So what's going to happen when this bakes is all this, it's going to melt together anyway. So we don't have to get too nutty about covering every inch, but you do want an even spread, right? Okay, so I'm just going to reconfirm my rectangular shape, and that's pretty good. So now let's roll. Okay, so we're going to gather our roll, and we're going to roll lengthwise, or yeah, I guess lengthwise. We're going to roll the long way up.
Quick question, Sam.
Yes, a
Could
question.
you add raisins or walnuts? And would you do that now?
What a great question. And I kept thinking to myself, remember to mention add-ins. Yes, this would be the place to put any add-ins you want. Yeah, nuts are great. Dried fruit, raisins and walnuts are real traditional. But you can go crazy here. Put whatever you like in here. You know, you and this is a good time to experiment, and I don't know, I'm thinking pistachios would be really nice, but yeah, cranberries, dried cranberries, any dried fruits and nuts are good, and even other spices and things for that matter. All that stuff will just roll in. Though just the only thing to keep in mind there is you want it evenly distributed so that you get an even swirl. Another question, yes.
Could you use this filling in a vodka?
Sure, yeah. This is a nice filling. Okay, so when I kind of tidy my ends as I go because it wants to spread out on the ends, and you can see I'm not getting super tight here. You want to leave it a little bit loose, just so that it can grow, and you don't want to squeeze the filling right out. And there we go. So as I mentioned, I like to kind of pinch a little bit of a seam. And you could do, I have this giant cutting board I'm using here, but if you were just doing this on your counter, you can transfer this to a cutting board for this cutting section, or you could use one of those, like pastry knives, not directly on your counter, like a pastry cutter. If you have one of those, I do that sometimes. A knife will get you a little bit of a cleaner cut. So you just want a good sharp knife. I'm just going to use a 8-inch chef's knife here. And we're going to cut it into about 7 to 8 pieces. I find I think our recipe says like 7, or it just says 2-inch. I want to say it says 2-inch, 2 inches thick. And so it's not really specifying. And like I mentioned, it's probably now about, I want to say 15, 16 inches. Yeah. So it grew 4 inches this way just with all that rolling and stuff. So, you can cut it as you see fit. I think I usually end up cutting it in about 8 pieces. And so they're a little larger than 2 inches, but let's see. This is, since I have my measuring, this is fun measuring everything, right? So that's a 3-incher, and that's going to be a nice big one. And what I'm going to bake them in is this skillet. And so this I've just lightly oiled. A good thing to bake cinnamon rolls in is like a lasagna pan is another good thing, or even like a pie tin or a cake pan, pretty much anything you can fit them in. The skillet is kind of cool because it just has that good thick composition, really holds the heat nicely and evenly, and it just kind of looks cool, I guess. So 3, 4, and you just want to cut them in pretty even pieces. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Yeah, it almost invariably this recipe comes out to 8 for me. So I usually throw one in the center, and then on these end pieces, I'll put that side that I kind of capped. Put that side down because you want to see the swirl, and then you can see how that goes. And again, you don't want to pack these in too tight, just like we didn't want to roll too tight, because they're going to grow. Oh, and we're going to let them grow by 25%. This one's a little bit taller, so I'm going to put that one in the center because I think that'll look cool. And then I kind of got the rest of them, the other 7, pretty even, amazingly. This may be the best I've ever done with that. So, so that middle one will be a little taller, and hopefully it'll kind of spread out and be our centerpiece. And then these other 7 fit perfectly around it. And this is a 6-inch skillet, if you're curious about that. So, like a 9-inch cake pan would work pretty much very similarly. And these will grow to fill up almost whatever you put them in. And you could do smaller ones if you want to do like a bigger pan, and yeah. So at this stage, we've got our filled cinnamon rolls, and so you cover those. Again, you can use a towel, like a tea towel, or you just reuse your wrap if you use wrap on your dough. And you just want to cover them, leave them at room temperature or into the refrigerator if you're doing an overnight rise. So if you're making these tonight, for example, get to this stage, just pop this in the refrigerator. And then what I usually do is I'll set my alarm for pretty early. If I'm thinking about baking them off at 8, I'll wake up like at 5:30 or 6. Just go down to my refrigerator, pull them out, and put them to rise, and then I'll go back to bed, and then I'll wake up and they'll be ready to go. Get up, turn on my oven, preheat, and like that. Yes, another question.
Someone is wondering why you did not choose to use parchment paper.
Parchment paper is totally fine. You can use parchment paper. I think I didn't, just because I'm being lazy. I'd have to cut out a circle of parchment paper and make it fit, but that is completely legit, and parchment paper is a great way to go. It would work wonderfully here. Yeah, so feel free to use parchment paper. It will work for you. Okay, so let us pretend that those have risen, and then we had it. When you're ready to bake, you want to preheat an oven to 350 degrees, and then they go into the oven, and these take about 25 minutes to bake at 350 degrees. So let's see what we've got. And I'll pretend these are hot, but they're actually not. That's why I'm able to grab the handle, right? But I baked these off a little earlier, and so this is the final bake. Yes, another question.
How long can you keep them in the refrigerator before baking?
Boy, you could keep them in there. I mean, as I mentioned, you know, overnight for sure. So that's, let's just say 8 hours average, right? But you could keep them in there. I will, I want to say up to 12 hours. I mean, they're going to they're going to keep growing. And once they're in this form, you know, your finished roll, you're not going to be wanting to punch them down, right? So it's just kind of, you want to get them before they're overflowing out of your pan. But I'd say you have a good 12 hours there on the outside. Um, 8 to 12 hours, which is, you know, I think I have only gone like 8 hours or maybe 9 to 10. Um, but you could probably get away with a little more. Yes, another question.
Do you recommend a convection oven for baking? And if so, what temperature would you do?
Well, I don't really like to bake in a convection oven. I'll use I use convection when I'm like roasting vegetables or things like that. Um, but with baking, I feel it dries things a little bit and it does move them along a little quickly. So like with a yeasted dough like this, you still want it to keep growing, and once you put it in the oven, it's going to continue to grow a little bit. And so I like a little more of a gentle heat than the convection. So if you can avoid convection, that's what I would recommend. Um, yeah, yes, another question.
Will they continue to rise while cold?
Um, yes, in the refrigerator, they will rise, and that's sort of it's one of the things with a yeasted dough is the refrigeration and will slow down the process, but it doesn't stop it. So it will continue to grow, and the yeast will continue to do their thing and puff up your dough, but it will be much slower. And that's what's handy about refrigerators and yeasted doughs. Another question.
One more.
Yeah.
Sometimes after rising, the center will pop up. Would you gently push it back to level?
Yes. Yeah. If you want a level, you could definitely do some gentle pushing, and then you'd be in good shape. Um, Ooh, and another thing, which I kind of meant to show before I chop those up, but you know, there's that, you could do another shape too, which is kind of fun, where you, once it's in a roll, you just kind of hook the two ends together into like a wreath, and then you can do slices, and then you could do, you know, you have like one of those style of, I know there's a word for it, it's escaping me, but if you've seen that, that's kind of a cool way to do it, like for a brunch or something like that, and you can just pluck your cinnamon rolls off that wreath, and that's another style. And then you would just simply put it like on parchment paper or a lightly oiled baking sheet and bake it off. Now let's look at an icing. So the icing we have for you here is a cream cheese icing. So we're using a 1/4 cup of cream cheese, which is 2 ounces of cream cheese or a 1/4 of a stick, and then the 1/4 cup of butter, which is 1/2 a stick, and then we have a teaspoon of vanilla extract here, and then the powdered sugar. And so we have a cup of powdered sugar, and I like to sift the powdered sugar, and this just helps avoid lumpage. And so I'm just going to do a little sifting here.
Sam, I got another one.
Yeah, got another question.
Could you freeze the rolls before you bake for a later date?
Definitely. Yeah, I think they freeze well. Let's see. If I were freezing them, you might leave them in, if you're able to, leave them in the roll and like wrap that roll really well in plastic wrap, and then put it in the freezer, and you could put it in, what I do a lot, what I like to freeze stuff. I freeze stuff all the time, and like if I get like a bunch of really ripe berries or something, and I just put stuff on baking sheets, and I do that like with this. I freeze it first on a baking sheet, whatever it is, and I think that would work with your roll, just so that it's not all topsy-turvy, and then it will freeze, and then you'll have a solid log, and then and then I think that's a neat idea. And then you could thaw it out to where you can run a knife through it, cut it up, and it actually might slice really well if it's just coming out of, just thawed. You could probably get a really clean slice out of it, and that'd be pretty cool. Yeah.
Could you bake these separately?
Yeah, you could bake these separately. Put them on a pan, like a sheet pan, and you might get a little more spread that way, but they would bake fine. All right, so for the glaze, we're calling it, right? We're going to use KitchenAid. You could also use a hand beater, like an electric beater would work for this. You want something that's really going to whack it around though. So we're going to start with the paddle blade, and this is what the paddle blade looks like, as opposed to the whisk. Now I do have the whisk handy here because sometimes I find the whisk is kind of cool for finishing and to really whip it up a little bit. But we'll see how it goes, because I did sift, and usually I end up with the whisk, like if I don't sift the sugar and I get lumps. Now the other thing that may give you lumpy glaze is if your butter is cold, but I did let this butter go to room temperature as well as the cream cheese. So hopefully everything will spread pretty nicely. And so I'm just cubing this stuff up a little bit so it mixes in a little more evenly. And we'll see how we go. Now with this, again, you can add, like we added just a little bit of water to the dough, if you remember, to get that shaggy dough. Here, again, you can adjust the consistency of this glaze by adding a little bit of water, and it's totally fine. But first, let's just do it straight and see what we've got. So we're just going to let that mix, and it should all come together like a frosty. And it's, there it is. I guess you guys can see it's sort of coming together a bit, and it just needs to pick up this this style of KitchenAid. It's hard to get the stuff off the bottom of the bowl sometimes. So what you have to do is sort of use a spatula and gather it back up.
I have a question for you, Sam.
Great question.
Adding milk versus adding water to the glaze, would both work?
Milk would be really good as long as it's Lulabelle's milk. And actually that is, the last time I made cinnamon rolls, which was just this last weekend for Mother's Day, I used milk, but yeah, milk would work great. And we could use milk too. I think that's a wonderful suggestion, and it allows me to bring out my lovely carton of Lulabelles with the cute cow on it. Um, and I can talk a little bit about our dairies. If you're not familiar, Basics has our own dairies. We make cheese from this milk, which is really great. And Willamette Valley cheese is our brand, as well as Lulabelle's cheeses. In our stores, we use that cheese and make pizzas, which you can take home and enjoy. But this milk is great. It's super fresh. If you're in the Portland area, you know, it doesn't get fresher than that. I visited these cows, and they're very happy. They get to hang out in pastures. This is organic milk. Um, we grow all the feed for these critters, and yeah, it's good stuff. All right, so I took your suggestion and added a little milk. And so it's really sort of up to you to like how you want your glaze. If you want a looser glaze, which I like it to be semi-loose, to where you can kind of spread it out and dollop it a little bit, not and a little less frosting like. And you know, and there's another way to glaze too, if you don't want to mess around with the cream cheese, the cream cheese adds a really nice flavor and and sort of consistency to this. So I mean, I would recommend just following this recipe, but if for some reason you don't have the cream cheese or don't want to bother with it, you know, you can make a pretty good glaze just with powdered sugar and milk or cream or milk and cream. And only if it's Lulabelle's heavy cream, and which is really good stuff. It whips up like crazy, like right away. It's kind of neat. Um, okay, so here's our cream cheese stuff, and so we can just spread this over, and that's your cinnamon buns, and that's sort of it. Now and one thing to keep in mind is these are really cool because I made them earlier in the day, so you want to let them cool at least 20 minutes or so, because if you apply this glaze while your cinnamon rolls are still really hot, it will just disappear. It just melts your glaze, and it goes away. You want to figure that into your um, timing of this as well, as far as when you bake it off. Yes, another question.
We're gonna rewind for a second.
Yeah.
Do you let the rolls rise again once cut before baking?
Yeah, that is what we've got going on here. So here's the rolls that I cut a little while ago, and they're already risen pretty good. It's kind of warm in this kitchen, and I would be, you know, I'd be fine popping these in the oven right now, because what would happen is they'll rise as soon as they hit that heat of the oven. Um, so what we're looking for once they're cut is about a 25% increase in volume. And you can see how they've already sort of filled in all the gaps that I left in there since we cut these. So yes, they are rising again. And it's just about a 45-minute rise or so there. Yeah, more questions.
Do you recommend eating the entire plate at one time?
You know, I can't recommend that, but it might be tempting and probably not unheard of. I don't know if I could handle it, but I will eat one just to see if they're any good after all that, right?
Would you do an egg wash on these?
You could do an egg wash. I don't know that it's necessary. You can see that they got a nice they have a nice golden brown color without a wash, but if you want to do a wash, that's fine. And again, you don't even have to to glaze them if you don't want to. And one thing that we want to look at here too, and this is another thing you can do, is just flip the entire thing over after it's baked. And what you have is this really great kind of caramelized glaze from your filling, which accumulates on the bottom. So I'm going to lift that up to the camera that way. And then you can see this is the glaze side. So that's another choice you could make if you just want to kind of have that sticky bun look. You know, you could just flip them right out of the skillet upside down, and then you have that neat side there, tasty and neat. So what it's going to look like on the inside, you can see it's really good and fluffy, and we have a well distributed filling, and they're good. It's a great recipe, and I hope you're able to make it soon. And I like that. Sounds like some of you are making it tonight. I might just eat this whole pan, as someone suggested. It tastes great. Well, I hope you enjoyed this experience, and I had a fun time doing this. And please come to more of our classes. I think coming up next, we're looking at some steak stuff. We can talk about beef and steaks, and I have a recipe for you, which is a simple steak with Greek island flavors, which is really nice for this time of the year. Do some grilling maybe. And that's next Wednesday, and then we're going to do chicken piccata the following Wednesday, talk about chickens a little bit. And those are, again, things that are within our system of basics, where we're raising these things, so we have really great fresh ingredients. If you haven't visited any of our stores, we have 5 locations around the Portland area: Sandy Boulevard, Tualatin, Hillsdale, the meat market, which is over in Beaverton, and the Lovejoy location downtown. Please come visit us. Send your questions to the email, and happy cooking.